of unjust imprisonment of our very own Sharjeel Imam. Sharjeel and the Betrayal, JNU and JNU. Sharjeel Imam, research scholar at JNU and a Muslim student activist, was charged with sedition on 28 January 2020. UAPA was imposed on him along with numerous cases in different states. This witch hunt of the state against intellectuals and students who dissent cannot be promoted. On this day, we have two eminent personalities with us, and we are very much honored to have them. Ms. Sabah Maharaj, PhD scholar, JNU, and also Muhammad Shah, PhD scholar, Virginia Tech University, USA. We heartily welcome the both of you to this event. Firstly, I would like to call upon Ms. Sabah Maharaj to commence with the session. Please. We are so sorry that Sabah is not with us right now. So we first move on with Mr. Muhammad Shah, PhD scholar from Virginia Tech University, USA. Please do commence with the session, sir.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. First of all, I appreciate and salute Fraternity Delhi University unit, along with other organizations and people who have been constantly voicing out their unconditional support and solidarity with Sharjeel Imam, who completes a year in prison. I don't know Imam personally. I have been familiar with his political activism over the past 1 year. So I don't think I'm actually a right person to talk about him. But however, I consider this as a small occasion for me to sort of register my little voice and conditional support for Imam, for what he stands for and for what he has become. I don't want to take much time, and I'm really looking forward to the speech by Sabah next. So I probably will limit myself in like 10 minutes or so. Many people already pointed out over many past occasions that Imam actually was a person who was outspoken and someone who has plan and vision. And Imam, however, was isolated and thrown out in the process, right? So he has been an outcast, an outlaw, a shame, a stigma, a scandal, right? And fraternity and those who support him actually embrace this scandal, and that needs a huge courage and determination, especially amid the so-called official revolutionaries who released a report few weeks ago about the so-called Delhi riot, putting the blame on the Muslim youth for speaking out, right? So those who released the report supported it and furnished their silence about it from CPM to the far left. I don't know what does that mean. Are actually sort of equally partisans in the ongoing state hunt against the Muslim youth across the country. Although I'm not surprised, it's indeed alarming, at least for those who find themselves on the left by heart and mind, that how much nationalized the Indian left was. And nationalization equally means in the current context to subscribe to the to the other spectrum against the Muslims, right? So, so it was the idea of nationalization that was heavily used, not just to sort of discredit and defame the anti-NRC movement, but also to co-opt and appropriate it. Right? And this is in a way actually following a similar pattern in the ongoing farmers movement spearheaded by the Sikh community in India as well. And we are actually witnessing a sort of unprecedented movement triggered by the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Bill 220. There has already been a huge chunk of literature produced about the bill from both the sides. Right? And one of the major black stains of the bill is its proposal to bypass APMS, right? Or Agricultural Produce Marketing Committee Act, that tended to give much more weight to the states over the center in regulating agricultural trade. Right? So this bypassing, actually the very bill itself is known as APMS bypass bill. Right? It's sort of justified with the rhetoric of nationalization of agricultural economy. And apart from the question of farmers' welfare, and the rhetoric of nationalization also needs to be accounted in the ongoing discussion, I think. This rhetoric, which is actually the core of the bill, plays its own role in sort of contributing and maligning and delegitimizing the movement by dragging Khalistan question into it and so on. So, so this pattern needs to be seriously studied. Why is the rhetoric of nationalism actually not simply a rhetoric? Right? Why do people immediately go defensive in the face of national, the face of the allegation that they are anti-national, or in the face of this particular rhetoric? Right? Why do the left parties and intellectuals still follow the idea that it is nationalism that is to be regarded to be the most fundamental and original demarcation and denomination of the people over class or any other categories, right? I think this is very important because this is the logic that drives Imam to jail and millions of Muslims landless in the future. Right? This needs to be embraced, especially in the context of the strongly emerging anti-caste discourse that crucially challenged any attempt to form a community based on Hinduism and its system of belief. Right? So the Dalit critic has always been a sword of Damocles hanging around the neck of Hindu community imagination. Right? So, but the question is Hinduism simply a religion or a system of belief? If not for the caste question, would have been a binding affirmation for the people. My point is this, that CIA-NRC movement actually demonstrated the instance in which what is called Hinduism attempts to sort of transcend the caste question by means of affirming the land as a first principle or a principle of belief. Right? So land becomes a principle of belief here, which over and again sort of strengthens Hinduism as more than a religion. Right? So I'm not saying that this is a strategic step to sort of bypass the caste question and recraft the Hindu social system. Instead, it was actually always and historically part of the Hindu imagination itself. Right? So the promise of the post-colonial nation was that it will maintain a gap between the land and religion. Right? But the issue was, which is being effectively dealt with now, is whether Hinduism, a religion distanced from the land, or has ever been. And this is not a new argument, in fact. Many scholars suggested the affirmation of land as a fundamental principle of Hindu nationalism, right? But alongside the other two categories, for example, land, religion, culture. I mean, most of the scholars who actually sort of mentioned the importance of land in constituting what we call Hindu or Hinduism only mentioned that land alongside or as a subcategory, right? Or alongside religion and culture. For example, people like Devari and Waitman don't even mention this, right? But Ashutosh Vashni actually identified it, but he also sort of uh, framed it as a certain kind of a subcategory, right? So my tentative understanding is this: land needs to be identified as a first principle of Hinduism. That is, land preceding the culture and religion. Right? And caste has never been located in the discourse of land. At least I haven't seen any work to that direction. Right? And caste has always been located within the discourse of culture or religion. And interestingly, the principle of land has even been affirmed by those who support the anti-NRC movement. Right? I actually remember reading a piece by Professor Akhil Bilgrami that reinforced the same logic of land as a first principle, right? When he theorized what is called popular Islam as against global Islamist. And we can see that the conventional discourse of this popular Islam has always been in some way. Sorry? Okay. Yeah, so Akhil Bilgrami's writing, it's very much like, predicated on sort of invoking its attachment or what he calls popular Islam's affirmation of the land as a first principle, right? So NRC legislation, in fact, a visible reiteration of the same logic as well. And also, I don't think we can see any historical instance where territory was not part of this imagination. Rather, it's integral and defining for what is called Hindu. Right? And what CIA NRC did was to show us that the line between nation and religion is in India, it's extremely thin. Not just that, actually the land precedes Hinduism, right? Now it's not hard for us to understand what the loyalty to the nation or maybe even citizenship means, right? This is the tricky part, because our political discourse navigates itself through the categories such as representation, discrimination, etc. And even we raise the banner of justice for Sharjeel Imam, right? But the fact that CIA NRC means that you are totally excluded even from such legal entitlements in India. Right? And in other words, justice would be served only to the believers, right? Not infidels. Now, what will happen to the champions of representation once the citizenship of a certain community is stripped off? And in fact, we are actually forced into a paradoxical situation where even the fashionable quote from Agamben won't save us from to articulate this, right? So this is actually a certain kind of an ethical question as well, and I hope we can see people sort of coming up courageously to address this. And now, what CIA NRC does is to sort of strip off the minoritarian position, if that was granted officially, of Muslims, and render them as equal on par with the state, you know, and therefore uncontainable within. Right? And the affirmation of the land here precedes the belief. In other words, Muslims cannot be Hindus, right? Or at least that is how it is held in common. Right? So therefore, Sharjeel Imam is an infidel, an outcast, right, to the nation, or So because this protest strategy was quickly misinterpreted or misrepresented to be as a disdain for the most sacred thing in India, right, which is territory or land. Right? So it's actually interesting to sort of, and pretty curious to see that his name is a common name, and he embodies the common destiny of an entire community. And yet he has been condemned, scorned, and expelled even from the most intimate spaces, right? And to be with that infidel, the heretic, the outcast, and embrace that scandal and that stigma is of course a courageous political act. And actually, even that very act itself has been excluded from the domain of the politics, right? So in fact, one cannot be Sharjeel Imam when we see, when we actually affirm or assert that we are Sharjeel Imam, even though we become forced to be Sharjeel Imam one day, right? And I have nothing but dua for him, and he's already in Dhimmat. And it has been actually more than a year since not just his imprisonment, but also since the anti-CIA and RC movement started, and its legacy is something that actually sort of there needs to be properly studied, understood, elaborated, etc. And it actually sort of overshadowed every other political question, precisely because of its association with territorial question or question of land, right? And that's what actually sort of excludes Muslims from citizenship entitlements or any entitlements actually that comes with the precise affirmation of land, right? And this movement also sort of exposed the kind of hypocrisy, and I won't say that it's a hypocrisy of so-called civil society in India, because the very constitution of civil society itself is actually a reiteration of in a certain way, right? Implicitly or in a certain other way, that a certain kind of reiteration of the most sacred thing in India, which is land, right? And that is where this question gets actually much more complicated, and we are sort of in a dead end, right? So how to sort of envision a political praxis for those who are actually stripped off from their all their basic identity to live in this nation, right? And so I'm not saying that we have solution here, or I'm not proposing either, but I'm just saying that this is something that we need to seriously ponder upon, and why Sharjeel is actually important this moment. Sharjeel was even not as confused as we are, or at least as I was actually when this NRC and CIA has been passed, and this lack of confusion and his sort of determination and courage is what actually makes him heretic or sort of outcast in from the contemporary political discourse that we all are actually sort of engaged in. So I sort of salute fraternity movement and many other organizations and people from different margins, sort of, who actually came forward and courageously declared their support for the heretic, for the heretic political position that was held by Sharjeel Imam. And I dua for him, of course, and I hope we sort of earn more light and insight in sort of going forward with this movement, and to sort of to the point of understanding the clarity and determination of Sharjeel. That's all I can say now. And Assalamu alaikum, and thanks for organizing this program.
Thank you so much, Mohammed Shah. That was great indeed, and something to ponder upon. We are very much thankful for your precious time. And we would like to apologize for Sabah's absence. She could not connect with us due to some network issues, and we do apologize for that. Instead, we have Snehashish with us, who is also a PhD scholar from JNU. I would like to invite Snehashish to commence the session. Please.
Hi all, Jai Bhim. Am I audible to you?
Yes, you are.
Hello, can someone respond? Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
So this is so scary to speak in the last moment, and yeah, like I'm not prepared, but Sabah and I have been talking, and on Sharjeel, yes, we have been in the moment, and we have been in the moment from the very beginning, from the time the NS and CA protest has happened, and how it has taken forward, and since Sarjil was arrested, and we have seen all those kind of narratives and rhetorics of movement that has happened throughout the movement. And yeah, as I am from JNU, and I'm from BAPSA, and most of you might be knowing BAPSA because fraternity has an alliance with BAPSA in the last election. And I have also met a lot from you, and we have been together in this fight. So so as the topic is about JNU and JNU and how they have betrayed, so this is kind of an interesting topic, like how JNU has been compared with JNU, right? Because it is somehow true. JNU politics, JNU academia has been dominated by the upper caste, especially upper caste left parliamentary groups. JNU, how the narratives have shifted. Yes, it has shifted. Initially, how in JNU Ambedkar was being called as a bourgeois person, constitution was called as a bourgeois document, but right now the left to ABVP all have tried to appropriate Ambedkar. So Sarjil also comes in the time when Ambedkar was appropriated. Sarjil also comes in the time when it's not just Ambedkar who was appropriated, but a lot of marginalized voices were appropriated, a lot of marginalized discourses were appropriated, and Sarjil kind of presented a rupture to it. So, as most of you know, JNU stands as an epitome to freedom of speech, right? During the 2016 nationalism debate, when Kanyakumar, Umar Khalid, and Nirvan was imprisoned, so the nationalism debate was coming, especially from JNU, and there was this freedom square which was established. The square, the place that symbolizes the freedom of speech and expression, and yeah, as all of you know, it's very funny to know, it's very necessary also to know, there is a difference between speech and voice. There is a contradictory stand on speech and on voices by left-led JNUSU, especially the upper caste in left-led JNUSU, who have been trying to cultivate something called freedom of speech, at the same time has been also appropriating, or whoever they cannot appropriate, they have been trying to suppress the voices of the marginalized. So speech is something, as we know, anyone can say we have a right to speech, anyone can say we have right to speech, that constitution guarantees us. Any progressive will say, yeah, you can speak everything. But when does that speech turn into voice? Yesterday I was giving I was also part of a panel discussion on can Muslims have a voice. Obviously I can't talk about whatever, like I cannot talk about what voices Muslims have or do not have in this country, but I can definitely talk about if Sarjil had a voice. A lot of you say Sarjil could not have a voice, but I'll definitely say that Sarjil, yes, indeed had a voice, and especially he had a voice. That's why he is criminalized. If it was a mere speech, if it was nothing but a speech that everyone has a freedom of, a speech we are giving in every platform, in every day of our, we're exercising in every day of our life, the kind of criminalization would still be in question. But Sajil's speech was translated into a communicative action. It was not just a speech, but it's a speech which could turn into an action, which could turn into a movement, right? He went to Shaheen Bagh on the day of, on the very first day NRCCA protest was happening. There was a mass mobilization. Sajil was talking about, we'll sit here. Then there are local MPs, local leaders who are talking about, kya hum Jumma yahin par karenge? Do you want to have the Friday prayer here? Then Sajil was one of the persons who was saying, yes, hum yahin par karenge. And that speech, especially the speech of doing something, it's not just a speech, it was an action speech. The speech was itself an action. A lot of people came together and they not just did the Friday prayer on the street, but they also redefined the idea of street. And that's where Sarjil becomes the voice of the Muslims. That's where Sarjil becomes the voice of the population who who didn't matter in this country, who ceased to matter, but they suddenly started to be the be the subject, be the subject of politics, of activism, of academia, of philosophy. Before that, no one knew Sahinbag. Before that, obviously, a lot of people knew Sahinbag, but in the activist circle, in the circle of academy, Sahinbag was an invisible place. Sahinbag didn't have as much value as JNU had. But Sahinbag, right now, at today's day, Sahinbag is the site where we're doing philosophy, right? Sahinbag is the site, the street is the site where we're doing politics. And how it happened? This happened because Sarjil had a voice, and that voice could turn into an action. And that's especially why Sarjil faced a lot of backfires, which was expected, which was definitely expected. Sarjil, in the first few meetings, like when Sarjil was arrested, at night we went to JNU. We asked them, "Are you going to put on a statement because once JNU student is being criminalized and a lot of media trial is already happening?" JNU said, "Yes, we'll do overnight," but days went by and JNU came with a statement after a couple of days. But then that statement was in a very normative, colloquial civil society, which is definitely uncivilized society in Delhi. There is nothing called civil society in Delhi. It's all uncivilized. Like what they did, they disassociated from Sarjil. They condemned Sarjil. They condemned his words. Then we had a lot of meetings. Okay, you might have a disagreement with Sarjil, but what is the disagreement? In their parcha or in their statements, in whatever people have written, you will never find what is the exact speech you are disagreeing with. What is the exact word Sarjil said you are disagreeing? Or are you disagreeing with the existence of Sarjil or the being of the Sarjil? Like Sarjil should not exist at all, right? They didn't have an answer. We asked JNU, what is the exact statement you disagree with Sarjil? They didn't have an answer. It's something like you're following the crowd. You're following yes, Sarjil has done something, and Sarjil has exposed. Sarjil has exposed the 70 years of betrayal. Sarjil has exposed all those people Savarna left to the Savarna Congressee who have ruled this country, who have done nothing for the masses of the country, for the marginalized population of the country. Sarjil has exposed. And not just them, Sarjil has exposed from the community, from the people who try to our voice, who come from our community, from the Bahujan community itself, from the Muslim communities itself. Sarjil has exposed them all. And that's why he became a threat. His voice mattered, and his voice was something like a threat. And exactly his voice was threat, even though his speech didn't have necessarily something that you have to condemn outrightly when he was prosecuted. Yet people did that. And right now, those people who are disagreed, who are disassociated with Sarjil, many of them are also criminalized. Many of them are in the fear of criminalization, and all of them need a sense of association. We are living in this society where disassociation is a heavy word. It can cost a lot. Disassociation you cannot really say, like, you cannot really translate disagreement to disassociation, right? Like Baba Sahib Ambedkar talks about the idea of fraternity. The idea of fraternity comes from, we can definitely say, in all our faith, in Islam, in Buddhism, in Sikhism, the idea of fraternity is present. But our constitution itself cultivates a morality that Ambedkar says that in constitution, the book is not as important as the constitutional morality we are trying to cultivate is. Ambedkar says the book is a skeleton, but the constitutional morality, that is equality, liberty, fraternity, and justice, that is the flesh. And without the flesh, the skeleton cannot exist. That the whole thing, that cannot be a whole thing, that cannot be a living thing, right? So constitutional morality talks about the word fraternity, and we must not confuse fraternity with secularism. In, like, in lot of colloquial languages we talk about fraternity and we talk about secularism. So especially the theka of secularism, the burden of secularism falls upon the Muslims. Ki how much secular are you, right? How much secular you have to prove your secularism every day of life. Like secularism has been seen as something that Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Christian, they all live together. And that's a sense of fraternity. That's a sense of secularism, right? But I think if we have to understand Indian society, uh, as we as we have seen in the recent past, there has been a lot of policies, there has been a lot of acts which are made, which we just cannot say that they are unconstitutional, but we have to assert that they are immoral, they are unethical. So the idea of morality, the idea of ethics, the idea of morality which are bringing from our faith, which we are deriving from our constitution itself, the constitutional morality we are talking about, so that's in the severe crisis. And how to cultivate that morality? Like, can we cultivate with the presence of secularism? Can we cultivate without the presence of secularism? Because if you consider secularism is Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism coming together, so I don't think we can cultivate morality ever. Because Hinduism is something that cannot exist without the structure of caste. And until in Indian society there is a caste system, in Indian society there is a caste system, there is a ethics of caste, there is a morality attached to the caste, there is a law and order attached to the caste. Till then we cannot have the morality which will something representing the universal humanity, the human aspiration for equality, liberty, fraternity and justice. So secularism, if it is coming together of all these kind of in a peaceful correlation, I think it is a failure. But this is not, this is a very limited idea of secularism, right? Secularism we have understood in a lot of ways. We can also, like Baba Sahib Ambedkar didn't have a right view on secularism. Baba Sahib Ambedkar says that secularism and democracy cannot coexist. Why? Because secularism is something that the state has imposed on you. The state decides that you will be, what will be a social order, what will the faith you will collectively follow. The state completely decides कि you will be secular, there will be a coexistence, your faith will be a private matter, it cannot be a public matter, there cannot be a public performance. So from the west to the Indian context, secularism has transferred its forms, its ways, its implementation, but the basic idea remains the same, that it's a state decision. It's not, it's, and in a democracy we do not believe in the decision of the state. We believe that decision of the state will be cultivated through the people. The social order will follow, the social system will follow, that will be cultivated in a democratic process, right? And Sarjil comes in that, and Ambedkar talks about, when Ambedkar talks about fraternity, Ambedkar says fraternity is something you cannot oppose, because fraternity is something about having an associated living, the sense of association. Sarjil has faced a lot of disassociation, yes, and in this age we are seeking the sense of association which is not there, and from the sense of association we can imagine fraternity. But that sense of association is not same with secularism, because sense of association is not uncritically bringing together lot of faith, lot of religion, lot of morality together, but the sense of association means the sense of democratic practice. Whatever you say, whatever your speech is, whatever the speech translates into voice, so whatever your faith is, that must pass through a democratic test, that the people will decide, the people will equally participate in cultivating the social order of this social order, and thus the political and thus the political system. The fraternity is something that, yes, we can say we need fraternity at this time. We need all the oppressed coming together. We do not just need it. This is organic solidarity that is building up. Right now, we saw how the farmers are protesting, especially from the Sikh farmers, how the protest has gone to some extent. And right now we're seeing there is a organic solidarity building up between the Sikhs, between the Muslims, and in the also anti-caste movement that is emerging. And also there has been a critic from the anti-caste movement to the to the Muslims or to the Sikhs, how the caste system has also been a part of the mainstream politics, and to build up that association, to build up that fraternity that we are seeking, we have to work in a multiple front. We cannot just say ki all of them coming together, but we have to see the kind of political imagination we are lacking, the kind of morality we are lacking, the kind of political imagination where from the lowest to the lowest rank of the society, it's not just a Bahujan movement, but it's the lowest from the Bahujan community, not just a Bahujan community, not just someone from the Bahujan community, but a oppressed gender, the oppressed gender can there are a lot of disabilities, there are a lot of sexualities. The lowest of the lowest person who can come and speak out there and give a speech, and that speech also doesn't become a mere speech. That speech also has to become a voice, and for that we need this democracy to work, this democracy to function. And the India was never a democracy. That's a fact. That's a truth. India was never a democracy. Ambedkar, in his interview in BBC, he's talking about in India the caste system, it's graded in such a order that we cannot imagine a democracy. And if we have to imagine a democracy, we have to attack to the root. We have to attack to the root, that is caste system. But right now, Sharjeel is a person who is not just invested into the autonomous self-respect Muslim politics, but who is also invested in anti-caste politics. Sharjeel has credited Bapsa a lot of times. Sharjeel has credited Bapsa for coming up to the NS and CA Muslims before his arrest. And Sharjeel even has been a friend to the anti-caste movement, has been a partner to the anti-caste movement, and not just to the anti-caste movement. Sharjeel also asks critical questions to the Muslims on their politics, on their stand, on the caste system, on a lot of things. And Sharjeel also has been a part of the Kashmir movement. In Kashmir movement in JNU, when we have seen the complete betrayal from the left-led JNU when 370 was abrogated. Sharjeel was also one of the person, you might have heard the speech, who was speaking fearlessly about liberation. So that's something we are seeing. Sharjeel, when we are talking about a autonomous Muslim politics, we are not excluding the sense of association we are trying to build. And the sense of association is not just between the oppressed. Sharjeel was imagining something like sense of association between the conscious people. Like Sharjeel was asking the Hindu friends, the upper caste Hindu friends, come with your people, come with your friends who have the sense of morality, who can understand why you are protesting for, and who comes in the terms and conditions of the oppressed, right? So terms and conditions, as in, it's definitely not possible for everyone to come without a terms and condition. But it's definitely, when the upper caste are coming with the terms and conditions, they're showing some sort of expertise over our movement. They're showing some sort of expertise over our voice. They're showing some sort of leadership. They're thinking us as an incapable being. They're thinking us as a voiceless being who they be voice for. So when Sharjeel is asking them to come with her friends to join a movement with our terms and conditions, he's cultivating some kind of morality for the upper caste. He's cultivating a kind of morality where oppressed will feel empowered, will feel emancipated enough to be the voice. Not just Savarna leadership where it's not just Savarna leadership we're needing right now. We're leading the leadership from our own community. We're leading the true leadership which can voice against the multifaceted oppression of this time. Sharjeel is talking to the allies or the upper caste communities. Do not be mere allies who will come to Shaheen Bagh and will click some photos and go back and sleep happily, but organize a protest in a mohalla, organize in a protest in GK, in CP, on all these upper caste spaces which has a lesser chance of criminalization. When Shaheen Bagh has more chance of violence, when Shaheen Bagh has a wider chance for criminalization, of prosecution, and a lot of things, the upper caste do not have those risks, right? So Sharjeel is cultivating some kind of morality among the upper caste without which without which we cannot really go forward with the movement, right? The movement is not just about the Bahujans. The movement is not just about the Muslims or the Sikhs here. The movement, until there is an upper caste, there will definitely be a lower caste. And to annihilate the caste totally, we also have to annihilate the idea of being someone in the upper caste, or the kind of privilege of power, or the kind of sense of pride, superiority the upper caste have in their mind. When we look back in JNU, I think I'll speak about someone who is very celebrated in these days among the progressive, among the liberals, even among the radicals of this society, Arundhati Roy. We all know how she has been outspoken against state and a lot of things. But when we approached Arundhati Roy for a talk in Sarjil, we know the exact words she said. She said that her support would be more detrimental to Sarjil. Her support would would have. She said that she is a prime target of the state, and Sarjil will have more like a kind of prosecution he won't have without her support. So what do we see here? What do we see here? A sense of pride among the upper caste. If she is such a prime target of the state, why Sarjil is in jail, not her? Right? I'm not expecting her to be in jail or not, neither wishing that. But the point is, without her voice also Sarjil is in jail for like 1 year, right? Without their support, who think they are the prime target of the state, we know who are being prosecuted. It's the Bahujans who are being prosecuted. It's the Muslims and Sikhs are the prosecuted. It's not the upper caste who are speaking up, are prosecuted in a rate in such a rate where the marginalized are prosecuted, right? So what kind of pride is there? What kind of superiority that there? Who thinks that she has a larger voice, she has a critical voice, or her voice matters more than Sarjil? So this is very common. Like I just gave one example, but a lot of lab professors, a lot of other professors in JNU also turned their back to Sarjil, and lot also threw them under bus without really have a critic. Like we do not expect you not have a critic against Sarjil, right? We expect you to have a critic of Sarjil. We expect you to have a critic of yourself or anyone. But that critic also must go through a democratic process. That critic cannot translate into disassociation. That critic cannot translate to condemnation when someone is prosecuted or the witch hunt. That critic to tell Sarjil that I have a disagreement with you, we need Sarjil back with us. We need Sarjil here among us, who we can tell Sarjil that we have a disagreement only with you, and Sarjil can tell us that he has a disagreement with us. And in that process, we cultivate some kind of democracy that this country never had. Sarjil had a lot of views. Sarjil is a person who had opinions, who had real opinions, and who is open to his opinions to be debated, to be discussed, to be critiqued. Sarjil had his opinion on constitution. A lot of people will say that Sarjil was putting risk to constitution, to be mocked, to be targeted, to be yada whatever. But what I think, Sarjil is one of the persons who brought constitution down to the street. Sarjil knew that constitution is the living document of the people, of the masses, and it's not enough to just pledge the preamble. It's not enough to hoist a tricolor. What people do really need now to know the history of the constitution, to know the technicalities of the constitution, to know the critique of the constitution, to understand their rights, their duties, and constitution cannot be a mere document right now. Constitutional morality must be cultivated. Why? Because we know that constitution cannot work in parliament. Parliament has been a microcosm of Indian society. Parliament is just an agrahara. In parliament, we are seeing during EW's in EWS voting in Lok Sabha, except 3 Muslim MPs, everyone else had supported. Can we just say that it is an injustice? So if it is something about justice, then justice is not just a legal claim of this time. Justice is essentially a moral quest. Justice is something we have to cultivate together. And to cultivate together, we need to cultivate that morality down in the street, not in the parliament, not in the classroom, which is Brahminical, but the street, which has been occupied by the minorities, by the marginalized, by the oppressed section of the society. And Sarjil brought the constitution to the street, and which is necessary, which is absolutely necessary, because right now street has street has such a value that classroom doesn't. Street has such a value that parliament doesn't. We are living in the situation where we can see, where we can where we are seeing the Indian democracy has failed us, where we can see that Indian democracy never worked. We can see that the morality the Ambedkar was trying to cultivate, Phule was trying to cultivate, that morality is somewhere has reached the marginalized, but it's not a majoritarian morality right now. The classrooms have failed to cultivate that morality. But right now, if anything is holding up to the Ambedkar's value, is anything holding up to Phule's value, anything that holding up to Iqbal's value, anything that is holding up to uh, lot our thinkers' value, then that's right now is the street. So in the street, no one will condemn the constitution without having a critic. If it is brought back to the street, no one will appreciate the constitution without being entitled of the rights. So this is something we deserve right now. This is something we must understand about the constitution right now. The constitution needs to be reinstalled as the document of the people, not the document that BJP or anyone in the power can appropriate or can bend to anything to their ideology. So right now we are seeing the parade of Ram Mandir in streets, and on the other hand we are seeing the tractor parade. So we are seeing how have classrooms really have failed. The upper caste intelligentsia who have dissociated from Sarjil, and upper caste intelligentsia who have talked about freedom of speech, at the same time restricting the idea of freedom of speech or curtailing all the radical voices. They do not that's questioning their status quo of this time. Then the only hope we have, that is an action on the street, and Sarjil has been one of the founding persons of that action. The action is called Chakka Jam, right? The action is called block the roads, block the streets, and stay there until you achieve your justice, until you cultivate a morality. So it's a longer fight Sarjil has waged. It's not just immediate action to gain something out of the protest, that is citizenship. But what is that citizenship without morality? What is that citizenship at all without justice? What is the citizenship when you cannot guarantee your survivability, you cannot guarantee dignified living? So that citizenship must come with a sense of justice, that citizenship must come with a sense of equality. And I think one of the best foundations Sarjil has laid, that is Chakka Jam. And yes, JNU, and as you compared with JNU, yes, the university has been agrara, but it's also the duty of the marginalized student, of the oppressed in the university, to guide the movement, to lead the movement. And why Sarjil was condemned? Because he was a leader. And what the upper caste want in our movement is a leaderless movement. They want our leaders to be prosecuted. They want our leaders to be dehumanized, so that they can come to our spaces, they can appropriate in spaces. In Sahinba, we have seen after Sarjil was gone, there has been a lot of things has happened that has justified the caste system and the Hindu morality. There was Havan, right? Can you think such a thing happening in the presence of Sarjil? Why there is a need of intellectuals in the community? And why are we at all an intellectual? Why? If we are thinking the community have the agency, community can do it own, why we are studying even? The the whole purpose of being educated is to gain a sense of history. We can know that in history all these things have happened and how they have led. But the people who are protesting there, they might not have that accessibility, that privilege, that kind of, so that they lived in the juncture of politics and society. They didn't have that opportunity to have such a historical knowledge, have a technical knowledge like we have. And that's why we need the intellectuals from our community to be the leaders. We need a intellectual from the community, not just to debate among the community, so not just to debate in the academic community, intellectual community, but to bring the debate to the common people. So we are asking all of them to understand the constitutional technicalities, understand where citizenship comes, in which phrases it is coming, when which sentence it is coming, which article it is coming, and what are the rights you are entitled, and you have to question it. And this is how we actually must imagine a democracy. Without this, I think, if we are leaving, if we are leaving our movement to a leaderless movement, so I think the movement have a high risk of failing. The movement has a high risk of failing because the leaders especially are necessary, because we have cultivated leaders over time. Ambedkar was educated, especially why he could lead the society. Same goes with Phule, same goes with Iqbal, same goes with everyone else. So we need our intellectual, we need our people who have the sense of history, who have the sense of methods, who have the sense, who have the ideas about philosophy, about leading the protest to in our protest. And I think in making the whole movement leaderless, the left association, the uncivilized society of Delhi and everywhere else had a big role. They have made, and this is the same happening in the farmers protest. They have been criminalizing Deep Sindhu and all other people with their past histories, etc. They did something, they did that. This happened to Sarjil. So Sarjil was criminalized because he could do something, and everyone is saying that Sarjil instigated something, that's why he's criminalized. Deep Sindhu instigated something, that's why they are criminalized. But a thing cannot be instigated without having an audience who are instigated, right? So we must question their morality. We must not question Sarjil or Deep Sindhu who have done something revolutionary, but we must question someone who are instigated. Okay, why are you instigated? Why cannot you accept a mode of protest that is beyond your comfort zone? And our question must be different. Our question must not be why, what happened to the movement. Our question must be, why what happened to the movement is bothering you. And if you're bothered with something radical revolutionary happened in the movement, so your morality, your ethics must be questioned, your solidarity must be questioned. And to go forward, I think there's an organic solidarity building up between the oppressed. But why only we have leaders like Kansiram or Ambedkar, or why we have all these leaders from our community? Why can upper caste only be allies? Why cannot they be accomplices? Why upper caste cannot have such a leader, an anti-caste leader who will change the whole democracy of upper caste, who will change the whole politics of upper caste, who will change the whole social structure of the upper caste? Why they cannot build such a movement in their own locality? So that must be question. We must not ask what happened in the Sikh protest is justified or unjustified. What happened in the Shahinbag protest is justified or unjustified. We must ask why such protests cannot happen in your locality, in your communities. Is the risk, is us who are entitled to take the risk of the movement? Why cannot you take the risk of the movement? I think that question, the alternate question, the counter question is necessary. And I was not prepared for this speech, and I have taken a long time. And I just spoke what I have been speaking in a lot of platforms, and not a lot of platforms, but a few other platforms, and what I have been writing. So I think my apology for not probably not being not able to convey what I've like what the topic was specifically, but there was an absence of Sabha. I was called in the last moment, and I'm very thankful to that. And if Sabha has joined, I think she must have something to say, and she must have more important things to talk about. So I think yes, thank you, fraternity, and yeah, looking forward a real fraternity. We are looking forward a fraternity among all the upper caste and sorry, among all the oppressed caste, and also upper caste who have the sense of morality. Come in the fraternity. Join us beyond your ego, beyond your supremacy, and this conversation must go to the upper caste. I think a lot of our participants are either Muslims or the Bahujans. I think this conversation must not be limited to our own community. This conversation should go and challenge the morality of the people who have been so immoral, so heartless, who can say that our protest instigated. If a protest instigated something, that's because your morality is weak. Your heart is so weak that it cannot accept our mode of resistance. And I think it should reach there. And thank you all for listening so patiently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Snehashish, for your fire words, and you totally did a justice to that, and also for accepting our invitation at the very last moment. Thank you so much. Now we would like to move on to the question answer session. Also, observation and sharing of your experience is welcome.
Hello.
Hello, please. You may proceed with your question.
Yeah, sure. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. You are.
Okay. I think I have question for Mohammed Shah. Um, like when we see like how land entitlement um, give this power to caste structure and how it disempower marginalized people. Um, like I just want to ask, like, as this entire subcontinent, like every region has their own problems. So, I mean, how it's possible to have a unified? So, I mean, is it necessary? Like,
You mean, is it possible to have a unified
yeah,
conception of land in India?
yeah, yeah. Like, I mean, when the problems, like, there are certain problems that can be in a, I mean, some like see for example, the question of nationalities, like in some states, nationalities put their nationalism as their core So how
Probably,
we can
yeah. If I understood your
yeah,
question correctly, I'll try to answer. What I was trying to argue is that
fine.
so our understanding of secularism, nationalism, and all actually sort of reproduces implicitly its core conception of land, right? So land has never been sort of problematized in any discourse of caste or any discourse or any critique against Hindu nationalism. As far, I mean, at least I haven't seen any. And even, I mean, I could be wrong, but even the anti-caste critique also sort of operates in a certain kind of Nehruvian secularist, nationalist, socialist kind of order. Right? What I'm saying is that even that critic either sort of won't pinpoint the question of territory, right, land, right. So the promise that was made in the post-colonial situation in India was this, that there will be a gap, a distance between land and religion, right? And once what we call Hinduism is distanced from land, it doesn't have an existence because it will collapse by its caste contradictions, right? So it doesn't have have existence. So therefore, Hinduism in order for Hinduism to exist as such, it needs a very unified conception of land, right? A certain kind of uncritical concept, right? And that sort of steeps to or that sort of reproduced through many other narratives, many other projects, etc., but often goes unchecked, right? In our criticism or in any political engagement or any political criticism or any political project that emerged in post-colonial state. So my point is that the sort of political project we sort of imagine or political praxis we have actually has to be mature a little to the extent of sort of identifying the core of land as a conception, right? So that actually, in a way, that precedes every other projects in India. So that needs to be identified, and also sort of, as I said earlier, the discourse of caste that is actually confined within the domain of culture and religion has to sort of go forward to the extent of identifying the uncritical supremacy or uncritical position that was given to land, right? Which is actually implicit, not very explicit. And that is a question that I think it's fundamental about CIA and RC, and that is a question that sort of creates a lot of dilemma for us to move forward with this movement, as far as I understood. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. And also now I see a raised hand, Ashir Mohammed. You can please proceed with your question.
Hi, my question for Shan Mohammed. He in his speech, he mentioned something about the official recognition of minority held on par with the state, which therefore rendered uncontainable, something like that. So I didn't understand it. I understand this particular statement. So could you just elaborate it more?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I was trying to say that what actually CIA and RC did is sort of render Muslims nationless, right? Or I mean that is a prospect basically. So it seeks to sort of strip off their citizenship and all the legal entitlements that comes with it. Right? So what actually it does is to, it's very important that it actually sort of displaces or destabilizes the very conventional kind of political discourse in India, right? I mean, this political discourse always predicated on the question of representation, on the question of, for example, citizenship, right, and legal entitlements, inequality, etc. Right? I mean, that is a kind of normative political discourse in India, right? I mean, be it in civil society or any other communitarian spaces. But what actually CNRC did is to destabilize that political discourse and sort of render Muslims uh, uh, disqualified in that political discourse. That means Muslims are sort of outside the nation state, right? It also means that Muslims on par with, I mean, equal to, I mean, Muslims considered to be like another fabric, just like a nation state, right? All the political question actually is containable. It actually comes within the fabric of Indian nation state. But Muslim actually, it's actually has been observed by many people before as well. And Muslims becomes completely excluded. That exclusion also means that the recognition of Muslims as a fabric that is equal, right? Not different within, or not something that is containable within the larger structure of nation state, but its own equal. Therefore, uncontainable. It has to exclude. It has to be excluded. Right? It has to be expelled from the fabric of Indian nation state. But the challenge is that it actually questions the kind of normative political project we all actually sort of undertake, right? That bases itself on the question of representation, on the question of on the issues of discrimination, etc. And that is what actually makes this particular moment most distinguishable, I guess. Did I make any sense?
Yeah, thank you for your explanations.
With that, we come to an end of the session. And I would like Nida Parveen, President, Fraternity Movement, Delhi University, to appear for the vote of thanks.
Okay, so now am I audible or not? Can you see?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, fine. Okay, so now we are in the concluding session, the Sharjeel and the betrayal, JNU and the JNU, the 1 year of unjust and illegal imprisonment of Sharjeel Imam. So we are very grateful that we got a well-honored two guests for this talk, Mohammad Shah and Snehashish Das. And thanks, a special thanks to Snehashish for taking this floor at the very last moment. And I just can't believe that he, without any preparation, he could draft it very perfectly. And I believe that, I hope the Sharjeel makes us strong enough for that. And for sure, he have inspired the millions of Muslims in India. And thanks a lot to Mohammad Shah, Snehashish, and all other listeners who joined this Zoom meeting and other FP Live watchers. Thanks a lot again. Okay.
Thank you, and that is the end of the event.